Hi, you're watching a documentary business webinar. I'm Peter Hamilton, and our expert guest today is Dan Salerno. And our focus in a series of webinars has been on the legacy networks. There's just been so much focus on streaming, there's so much focus on the new creator-led economy that there's been real lack of analysis of the scale of buying, probably exceeding $1 billion, even from the handful of networks that we've looked at, that's available to producers. So we want to look at the opportunities that exist for producers. And today we're looking at history. So Dan, great to have you on board.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. It's always fun. This is what, our fourth one now?
Fourth one in this series of looking at the legacy networks, what they're buying, what they're spending, and what opportunities exist. So Dan, history. Started as the History Channel. It used to be known as the Hitler Channel because it basically programmed World War II era black and white series, for the golden generation that focused on the Second World War. And then I remember just this incredible transformation round about 2010 when there was a big shift towards, character-led immersive series. I remember the legendary network executive Nancy Dubuque at a history conference in New York used the word immersive and character-led, used those phrases for the first time. And that represented a shift where history even embraced um, scripted series like the Hatfields, and was even written about as possibly challenging broadcast networks. Its
Yeah.
audience was so meteoric. There's been a return to somewhat of a return to traditional history topics, and that's what we're going to look at today. So, why don't we get started, Dan? You've done the analysis, and so today we're going to talk about what history's spending its money on, specials versus series, genres, the estimated spend, and trends.
Yeah, I love the history of the history that you just outlined because it has been a sort of a storied evolution, right? A network that got us launched way back into the retransmission consent days, I think it was, um, to where it is today. For me, personally, I love history, the topic, the genre. So I do find myself, outside of our kind of our work and our career analysis, I find myself personally gravitating. I've seen every episode of Ice Road Truckers. Not don't feel guilty at all about admitting that. I love that series. And I do watch almost all of their tentpole specials. Most recently, the Joe Louis, Max Schmeling special that came from LeBron James's company. So they do some great work. But today, what we're gonna talk a little bit about is, what they are broadly, and we can bounce back and forth on that, Peter. I know you have a similar experience and a passion for history as I do. But then, like we've done with some of the other brands that we've talked about in this series, really kind of dig into, what is the current History Channel? Where are the opportunities for the producers that documentary business serves? Specials versus series, the types of genres and how far they go. And then we, as always, we do our own without any inside scoop, but just years of experience. We kind of take some shots at what some of their trends might be and how much they're actually spending. And it's quite a robust brand. It really is.
Let's go to the next
So
slide,
before we
Dan.
jump in, I don't know, you want to add to anything there?
No, thanks for asking, Dan. I think let's go to your first slide, which is, really fascinating to me. The scale is surprising.
Yeah, the I think by now, I hope by now, some of our regular attendees are familiar with the format of what we've got up here. We've got 3 years worth of tracking. We can go back a little further if we want, but this is probably the most relevant. And there are a couple of things that we want to highlight here. Um, First of all, the total number of hours has remained remarkably consistent for these past 3, 4, 5 years. we're
And
looking
Dan,
at
it's a lot.
yeah, and I think that's the key. It's, we've seen with, Discovery, we watched it go from what, about 600 hours to 400. With Nat Geo, we watched about a 25% drop over the last couple of years. But History, we have not seen that drop. They have held steady with the volume. They've also held fairly steady with the number of unique titles as well. And that's important too, because they're not just sort of diving into, 20 episodes of everything as opposed to 10, and there are fewer brands, but more episodes of each brand. They've continued to sort of hold serve with everything. And even when we look at 2026, which is obviously not complete, there's still a lot to come. I won't be surprised if we see History exceed last year's totals. I mean, they're already, I even found another 6 hours last night that I haven't added to this list yet. They're sitting at about 330 hours now. They don't have much further to go to match last year. That being said, they have announced their upfront, which usually fills in some of their heavier bulk. But yeah, it's quite a robust offering, and there's a mix throughout here of new and legacy, if you will, about half and half. A little off memory here, but I think of the 28 series that we see in this calendar year thus far, 12 of them are first seasons. And surprising. The remainder are continuing seasons of an existing brand. 12 out of 28 are new seasons. Those are new opportunities for producers to pitch, to be greenlit, to have their way in. And it's it's a pretty cool thing if you're a producer. And of that 12, 7 of them are new producers to the brand. So they're quite active. When we always hear these folks on the panel say, oh yeah, we're open to, new producers soliciting us. And then, breaking in and getting in the door is really difficult in today's environment. History is looking like they've got that door wide open, at least in some of the research that we've done.
Dan, so the overwhelming focus is on series, even limited series, which were 3 to 4 episodes, and then specials, even fewer, and 1 hour specials, which is the meat and potatoes of emerging producers, for instance, 0.
Yeah, it's there really isn't. Clearly, it's not like a recent trend. I mean, they haven't had a 1 hour special in quite some time. If you're going to do 1 hour, you may as well do 2, I guess. They've done some of these more feature doc things and then limited series. They use them as tent poles, which I believe we talked about in the past. They might be a 4-parter on something. Most recently they did a Roman Empire series out of October Films. There was a 2 by 120 across a couple of nights. They revived Modern Marvels. It hasn't come up yet. I think it's coming up in August, and it's a limited run of 3 episodes. Maybe that's a pilot run. We're going to see. I mean, it's a brand that has been a real hallmark brand for History over the last 2 decades. So maybe we'll see that. They've got a couple of, this year they've only had a couple of these feature docs. One was the one that I mentioned that I watched on Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. That came from LeBron James's production company, Uninterrupted, where they'd done a couple of specials for History Channel last year. The other one is upcoming. I don't have a date on it yet or much details, but they announced a new special coming up for the 9/11 anniversary. This is the 25th anniversary of 9/11 this year, and they've got a new special coming from Arrow Media. Our friends at Arrow Media are doing something there. So very limited, very select, in the moment. But the heavy lifting here is series.
So let's look at the genres then.
Yeah, well, as we dig into the genres themselves, we start to get a better sense of, where these series settle into the buckets. We can kind of break it out a bit. These are my genres, as we've talked about in the past. They're not There's no formal labeling here done by the network. History probably has their own set of buckets, I'm sure. But for at least, our, kind of classification purposes, these seemed like a broad-based, trackable genres for me. I'll start at the top and just work our way down with some definitions, and then maybe we can dig into some of the more specific examples and the trends on the next slide. History is pretty much what it says on the book cover there, or I guess in the UK, what do they say? Like, it's what's on the tin or something like that. History is history. No surprise, we're seeing History Channel with the history genre, and they've been doing a lot of it, a lot. And we'll go more into that on the next slide. Unscripted is a broad-based label that I've put on there for things that don't really fit conveniently in some of these other places. There are going to be things like Mountain Men, Curse of Oak Island. Back in the day, it would have been Ice Road Truckers. So some of the more format-driven obdoc character type of things that you referenced from that are really the legacy of Nancy Dubuque on the brand. Transactional was a little bit of a subset of that, and it's very specific with transactional. It's Pawn Stars, American Pickers, and a couple of spin-offs that come off the back of that. Paranormal is driven largely by the unexplained and ancient aliens. The proof is out there. They've made a pretty good living with this genre. Paranormal is probably a little bit too narrow of a single word, but it gives me something to kind of work with. And then the Built franchise is very specific. They kind of had this little subgenre that they've done rather well with, where the food that built America is probably the most prominent one. But over the years, they did the toys that built America, and mega brands that built America, and Titans that built America. So they had a franchise running, so I thought it was good to break it out and work our way through it. But if we want to hit the next slide, Peter, we can, drop into some of the trends on the specific ones and just see where they're going. And I think, Peter, when we were prepping for this, you had pointed out that transactional seems to have sort of fallen a little bit from actually the years prior to this chart and steadied itself in the last couple of years. And that's no surprise. Transactional are the two real granddaddies of their network, with Pawn Stars and American Pickers. And
so Pawn Stars must be up to 500 or 600 episodes by now.
You are correct. If you were betting on the Price is Right showcase, you would still be a little under the number. The last count that I saw on their declared site, 662 episodes of Pawn Stars. Can you imagine? That's just an unbelievable number. And it's a real compliment to, I know you and I both have a few friends that have been involved in that series, and we're really happy for the success of that brand. And it's, it really drove a genre and a format for a lot of folks trying to copy it. I have said quite often, and not always to the agreement of nonfiction filmmakers, but I'll stick with it. I firmly believe that what Pawn Stars did for history is the same thing that Mythbusters did for science, and that is made it fun without removing the takeaway that you would get from a very traditional history single-hour documentary. I think there is as much history embedded in an episode of Pawn Stars as there is in a 1 hour history of blank subject matter out there. They just made it a little bit more relatable and fun for a younger audience. And, the fact that it continues after all these years, I think is a real testament to their success. American Pickers is simultaneously, they find a way to kind of use history as a through line, but really get into, some of the fun, more transactional, formatted kind of stuff, which is really neat to watch. And they've actually had a few spinoffs. Both of these brands have had spinoffs over the years that kind of add to the collection. But by and large, there's still the main series that are the thrust of that genre.
So Dan, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Pawn Stars, we covered it in enormous detail in Documentary Business. We had post after post of original analysis and webinars, etc., about that series. We use it as a super case study. So the history of porn stars is that the 2008 financial crisis hit, and the programmers at A&E sent out a call, realizing that with the financial crisis, people's interests would shift from lifestyles of the millionaires to more kind of thrift-based subject material. And so they figured out that they put out a call for in that category, and they also even figured out that Las Vegas could be a good destination, and that became the basis of porn stars. Brent Montgomery and Left Field responded, and the rest is truly history. So I'm wondering, today we're in a period of kind of billionaire and trillionaire focus, and yet there's obviously a lot of financial concern amongst everyday Americans, which must be, the average cable and satellite TV viewer. I'm wondering, just, hey, I'm throwing one at you, Dan. What kind of themes history could be exploring right now?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I don't know that I have any grandiose insights other than to say that I think the desire to be rich, to be successful financially, and in every other way you can imagine, is as old as television itself. I'll even go back to kind of related, not really directly related, so you'll have to kind of work with me on it. But one of the most successful formats, black and white television. One of my early mentors and managers in the business, Chuck Ingold, would talk about was Queen for a Day. Everybody wants to feel like they're the queen for the day or the king for the day, or they're kind of running the show, even if at midnight the clock strikes and you have to kind of go back to being Cinderella. You had your moment. And in some ways, I think Pawn Stars and some of these other things tap into that. Lifestyles of the rich and famous, of course, preceded that very famously. You've got Bravo series kind of floating around out there with the $1 million, homes and stuff. I think it's kind of innate in the human condition to want to succeed and want to be better, hopefully for the right reasons in a proper manner. Otherwise, that would be called the True Crime Network, I guess, with bank robberies. But in some ways, I think Pawn Stars and American Pickers taps into that a little bit. That we can all kind of find it in its own way. And then the interesting thing too, I would add, Peter, a little historically in the same genre with American Pickers. I can remember working in Latin America probably about 15 years ago. And looking at, what were some of the more successful series on cable, largely American cable brands that migrated into Latin America. And some of the best performing shows were American Pickers and Pawn Stars. And so despite the American focus, right, it translated, it traveled really well. For them, at least at the time. And it just starts to speak to the universality of the themes that both of those series engineer.
Dan, that's really interesting. I got another question for you. Looking at paranormal, there's a lot of paranormal on a lot of networks. So how does a network like History brand paranormal such that it uniquely or strongly speaks to the History brand? It doesn't become just a unique category that you can find as you graze your 400 legacy channels, as well as endless streaming opportunities.
Another good question. I think one of the things that I would say is that looking at the list of what makes up this paranormal batch this year so far, you've got The Unexplained, you've got Ancient Aliens, and you've got the Proof is Out There as your core. You also have something called that I put in there called Secrets Declassified with David Duchovny. So they're kind of leaning into Duchovny's brand hosting, experience from his X-Files days, The Secrets of the Skinwalker Ranch. And then they've got spinoffs of The Proof is Out There and Ancient Aliens that they continue to do. So they'll have like the Alien edition of The Proof is Out There. I think by and large they've kind of just stayed steady. It's not a genre that I watch much of, so I can't speak to it editorially as well as I can some of the others. But they've stayed steady with, Ancient Aliens is 20 plus seasons now,
Right.
and they've effectively embedded it. And you go back to even Nancy Dubuque's era, and Nancy Dubuque really opened up the definition of history itself and took it out of the library and the dusty books and broadened it. Ancient Aliens was part of that. I think The Unexplained builds on that. Of course, it's got William Shatner, again, affiliated with science fiction. So they're using these characters in their sort of heads and tails hosting, I think, to kind of brand it, as opposed to maybe some of the other series that are a little bit more, call it traditional, in the cryptozoological world, where you get Loch Ness and the Yeti and Bigfoot. I don't think you get as much of that here with history. The other thing is they are rather effective, I think, about programming on nightly basis with their themes. So you kind of know what to expect and when to expect it. And Friday night has been their night for this type of content. So, you can go back years and years, and if you're still a little bit of a traditional viewer, you start to get comfortable with knowing what it is and where it is. And that's probably one of the big reasons for their success.
Very interesting. So, there's quite a spread. Paranormal, about 25%. It's very interesting. Dan, let's go to the next slide, and let's move into the big takeaways. And my big question for you is represented by this poster here of World War II with Tom Hanks. Does this represent a shift, first of all, to the classic, Hitler channel, or secondly, more generically to history topics and away from the, character-driven immersive series like Pawn Stars?
Yeah, I think the answer is kind of a little bit of a yes and a no in there. The yes part is very much, it's a return, or it's part of a return. I don't want to say it's the one that has triggered the return, but history itself has been evolving like every network and every brand over the last few years, as they pivoted a little bit from that character-driven, unscripted stuff that we talked about into a little bit more of the core history stories that we all know and love. They're under different franchise names, and it's usually History's Greatest Blank with John Doe, fill in the celebrity. And they've had, both announced in the coming up and even in the past, Ving Rhames, Danny Trejo, Tom Hanks here with World War II, David Duchovny. The big one is Lawrence Fishburne with History's Greatest Mysteries, which they've got, 6 seasons or something like that, over 100 episodes, and very, very core history stories throughout. And even coming up this fall, they've announced history series with Tom Selleck, with Ted Danson, with Kevin Bacon. So they're very much leaning into the history subjects that we kind of know and love in over the many, many years of nonfiction, but and then fill in their celebrity that they can use both as a top and tail host and as a driver for promotion.
So Dan, I don't want to get ahead of you, but the third bullet says celebrity host wraps used for series of all genres. So are they actually taking Lawrence Fishburne and other hosts to the shores of Normandy and to the pyramids, or are they actually studio shot wraps?
They're more the latter. They're definitely the latter. It's probably a cost-effective way to do it. I think we all would love to take Tom Selleck on on a you know, a 6 week trip around the world with the subject of a series. But on a practical level and a cost level, they bring them in and they do the wraps, and they do it rather effectively because they dig right in. You know, like I say, the Lawrence Fishburne series is sitting at 100 episodes and counting, and doing rather well. And even you know, they've got one with Dan Aykroyd now that I think will be heading into its third season if it gets picked up. The Duchovny series, Declassified, is heading into its third season. So not only have they've done a great job in bringing in some of these faces and names, but the series are clearly working because they're being renewed. And you know, without a big flashy ratings announcement, you can always tell something is doing pretty well if they pick it up again.
Are they archive based, Dan, or is there original field shooting?
They are probably a mix. A lot of it, I think, is archived because it depends on sort of what the story and what it lends itself to. But when in need, definitely you've got original shooting throughout. There's a consistency to it. If you watch some of them, particularly, I think a little bit more of the tentpole driven specials that are kind of like the bigger history subjects that they might come up with. You'll see the format there where it'll be, you know, original shooting of whatever the storyline may be, and then it's interspersed with interviews from a range of experts and commentators with a whole series of backgrounds in history or engineering or a certain era or whatever is appropriate for the subject. You know, when you're talking about the Joe Louis documentary, which I've mentioned a couple of times, you know, clearly you've got boxing commentators like Jim Lampley, Larry Merchant are kind of brought in to have that discussion. If you're dealing with something that might be, it's a little bit past now, but it might be Teddy Roosevelt or Ulysses S. Grant, you might bring in maybe a proper historian. In the World War II series, you'll have people like John Meacham, you know, who is a great storyteller of that era. And you'll have folks that come out of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans that are also offering sort of their expert insights, maybe people who teach at a war college or at the military academy at West Point. So you've got a series of experts just like you would, and you start to see some of the same faces across these series. They're clearly, history has developed a stable of some of these go-to experts to weigh in on whatever the subject may be of that particular series.
So Dan, there's a return, somewhat of a return, still a minority across all of history's genres to, you know, classic history topics. Now, are these shows developed and pitched by outside production companies, or are they actually their production managed internally by history's own production units?
Yeah, well, it's actually a really important thing for us to bring up because unlike the other brands that we talked about with National Geographic and Discovery, A&E Networks has got an in-house production entity that both A&E and history rely on quite significantly. Numerically speaking, if you recall, we talked about in terms of series, actual long-form series, not limited series. Series thus far this year, we're tracking about 28 titles. Almost a third of those are coming from A&E Factual Studios or Six West Media. They're two in-house brands. Some of those are sort of partnered up with third parties, but they kind of bring them in-house under their umbrella. Others are probably driven completely by their in-house unit. And I think what's important there is it twofold. Number one is it's an efficient way for them to operate. It's probably one of the reasons that A&E is capable, or sorry, history is capable of keeping up the volume that we talked about. They're 400 titles a year volume because they can get economies of scale, you know, within their own building, so to speak. And yet at the same time, I wouldn't discourage producers from thinking that the door is closed.
Yeah.
because there are still opportunities to partner with their in-house studio, as well as a good 15, 16 so far. And the year is not over yet. Titles out there to continue to work with. Of the new series that we tracked thus far this year, about a dozen of them, a little over half of them are coming from new producers that haven't worked with History Channel before. So, like we said, it's a real opportunity for producers to kind of break through and get in there. Now, I think one of the keys to that is the aforementioned discussion we had about celebrity hosts. My guess is if you can walk in the door with a great idea and a great kind of a format of an idea, and bring a celebrity host that makes a lot of sense for both the idea and the history brand, I'm sure that gives you a leg up with the development team. It makes it a little easier for them to go to the next stage of development and maybe work your way towards a green light.
Well, this is really great. Dan, so we talked about 400 plus hours. The average cost is what, 350 if you are 350,000 per episode?
Yeah, it's probably, my guess is the World War II series is a premium level, and it probably is kind of the outlier. It's the so-called, Russian judge in the 1994 Olympics ice skating. But the others that we've talked about probably fit very cleanly within that 300 to 400 range, if we're not too far off.
So it's a sizable spend, and
certainly is.
And you've outlined several paths for independent producers, and also to identify the current production companies who are supplying history, who are also, looking for ideas and talent in order to expand their relationship with history. Dan, this is really great. Next week, we're going to wrap up our 4 network analysis by looking deeper at the aggregate number of hours, the aggregate spend, the number of originals versus non-originals, the fresh production companies that are finding a place in the system. So we'll wrap up, and I think the big takeaway here is that there's just so much conversation about influencers and creators and the creative economy, and there's so much conversation about streamers, but those models are not necessarily offering the promise, the solid promise, a base that you can analyze that leads to opportunities for independence. And what you've done, Dan, through your totally original research, because nobody else is looking backwards, at the existing, pay TV model, and understanding how it continues and it's extremely viable, and that it offers, a really solid pipeline of opportunities for established and potentially new producers.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I know we're going to dig into it on our next webcast discussion. One little tidbit that I just picked up on this morning, a lot of this comes out of, just keeping up with the trades, which we all can do. Yep. There was a short little headline that I read, and I haven't read the article yet, that speaks to why Paramount, presuming Paramount's acquisition of Warner Brothers does go through, why they need to keep CNN in the fold for a myriad number of reasons. But one of the reasons at the top of that list is because that CNN, despite it being in the so-called dying, world of linear, can cash flow tremendously the debt that Paramount is going to have to absorb in this acquisition. And I think, what was the last numbers we talked about, Peter, that CNN was, slated to bring in like $2 billion with a B in revenue. So it's a reminder to us that, while the linear is challenged for sure, the cash flow that it throws off is tremendous. And the brands that we've all talked about.
They're long-term contracts too, Dan.
Absolutely.
They're long-term contracts. So they're forecastable.
Yeah. And, the brands that we've talked about here, they haven't forgotten that. Even if sometimes it's not kind of the fun thing to talk about all the time, but they're doing they're doing a lot of content, and for the production partners that we know and love through our careers, there's still a lot left in the gas tank there for all of us.
I totally agree, Dan. It's always great in conversation with you. You love your expertise and your original research, and we'll look forward to our next one. And thank you, Caitlin, our webinar producer, Mexico City based and always helpful.